The airport buzzed with the noise of rolling suitcases and hurried footsteps. Announcements echoed across the terminal, each one swallowed by the hum of travelers chasing their destinations. Among them walked a woman in her mid-30s, dressed simply in a pale blue kurta and worn shoes. In one hand, she held a faded leather bag. In the other, a boarding pass that she glanced at every few seconds. She looked calm, though the crowd around her barely noticed her presence. A few passengers whispered, their eyes darting toward the old bag and plain clothes. Some smiled politely. Others judged silently. But she kept walking, eyes fixed on gate C9. At the counter, she greeted the flight attendant with a warm smile. "Good morning," she said softly. The attendant scanned her ticket, hesitated, and then looked up in mild surprise. "Welcome aboard, ma'am." The woman nodded, thanked her, and walked down the jet bridge. Inside the aircraft, passengers were still settling in. The woman stepped through the curtain that separated the cabins and stopped in front of seat 2A. Before she could place her bag in the overhead bin, a stern voice echoed from behind. "Excuse me, ma'am." She turned to see the pilot, tall and crisp in uniform, walking toward her. His tone was sharp, almost defensive. "This section is for business class passengers only." She blinked, taken aback. "I know," she replied politely. "That's my seat." The pilot frowned, his voice rising. "Ma'am, this isn't economy. Please go back to your assigned seat before we call security." A wave of awkward silence spread through the cabin. Passengers turned their heads. Some whispered, others smirked. The woman's cheeks flushed, but she didn't argue. Instead, she calmly pulled out her boarding pass and held it out. "This is my assigned seat," she said again, her voice steady. The pilot glanced at the ticket but didn't really look. He sighed in irritation. "There must be some mistake." "You can't—" "Captain," interrupted the flight attendant softly. "Let me check the manifest." She tapped her tablet, scrolled, then looked up, eyes widening slightly. "Sir, she's listed as a special guest." "Seat 2A." The pilot froze. The air between them thickened with embarrassment. "Special guest?" he muttered. The woman smiled faintly. "It's all right," she said, her voice calm but edged with quiet strength. "Mistakes happen." The attendant quickly helped her stow her bag. The pilot, suddenly awkward, adjusted his cap. I apologize, ma'am. Please make yourself comfortable." But she only nodded and took her seat by the window. The murmurs around her faded into uneasy silence. Outside, the sun spilled golden light across the tarmac as the plane prepared for takeoff. The flight as the engines roared to life, the woman gazed out of the window, lost in thought. The reflection in the glass showed not the simplicity of her clothes, but the quiet confidence in her eyes. Memories flickered. Years of long nights, unpaid overtime, and a dream that once seemed too far to touch. When the seatbelt sign turned off, the pilot stepped out of the cockpit and walked slowly toward her seat. The passengers watched again, expecting confrontation, but his face now carried regret. "Ma'am," he said softly, "may I speak with you for a moment?" She looked up, surprised but polite. "Of course." He cleared his throat. "I wanted to apologize properly. I shouldn't have judged you by appearance." "I'm truly sorry," the woman smiled kindly. "Captain, apology accepted. But may I ask something?" He nodded. "Why did you assume I couldn't belong here?" The question hung in the air. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Finally, he said, "Habit, I suppose. We see so many people rushing through, we make quick judgments. It's wrong, I know." She nodded thoughtfully. "It happens to many of us," she said. "I've been judged all my life for what I wear, not for what I do. But life has a funny way of turning the tables." Her tone intrigued him. "What do you mean?" She reached into her bag and took out a small badge, silver, with an engraved logo identical to the airline's. She placed it gently on the tray table. The pilot's eyes widened. "Yes," she said, smiling. "I helped design this airline's safety program. Years ago, I worked as an engineer here. I left to start my own company, and we now supply the very software that monitors your aircraft systems." The color drained from his face. Passengers nearby gasped quietly. The woman continued, her voice calm but firm. "I wasn't offended because of your words, Captain. I was disappointed because you carry the uniform that represents respect, safety, and trust. If we judge by sight, we forget why we fly in the first place." He bowed his head slightly. "You're absolutely right," he said. "You've taught me something today that no simulator ever could." She smiled again, turned back to the window and whispered, "Altitude doesn't come from height. It comes from attitude." The landing hours later, when the plane landed, the passengers waited as the pilot made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice echoed through the cabin, "today I learned a valuable lesson. True dignity isn't shown by uniform or title, but by humility and grace. I'd like to thank one of our guests who reminded me of that truth." He paused, looking toward seat 2A. The cabin filled with gentle applause. The woman bowed her head slightly, humbled but smiling. As she exited the plane, the pilot stood at the door and saluted her. "Thank you for flying with us, ma'am." She shook his hand. "Thank you for listening," she replied. Outside, she stepped into the sunlight, the wind brushing against her face. She took a deep breath, her eyes shining with quiet triumph. She had faced countless moments like this, but this one ended differently, not with anger but with understanding. Moral, closing narration. A narrator's voice fades in as gentle piano music plays. In a world that moves too fast, we often judge too soon. We measure people by clothes, titles, and faces, forgetting that greatness often walks quietly beside us. Respect costs nothing, but it changes everything.